Michael Donovan had founded Horizon Systemics 25 years ago. What began in a rented office above a struggling hardware store had grown into one of the most respected software companies in the country. His name still appeared in company history presentations. His photograph still hung in the lobby. And every year, new employees learned how a young programmer with a borrowed desk and a stubborn belief in people had built something extraordinary. There was only one problem. Most of those employees wouldn't have recognized him if he walked through the front door. Time has a way of turning people into stories, photographs, legends, names on conference room walls. And on a rainy Tuesday morning, Michael Donovan was about to discover just how completely he had become one of them. Because before the day was over, the company he built would refuse him entry, and the people responsible would learn a lesson they would never forget. Rain tapped softly against the windows of Michael Donovan's kitchen. The 75-year-old founder sat alone at a small wooden table, a cup of coffee warming his hands. Outside, gray clouds drifted across the morning sky. Inside, the radio played quietly in the background. It was an ordinary morning, just the way Michael liked it. 25 years earlier, his mornings had looked very different. Back then, they had been filled with deadlines, investors, payroll concerns, product launches, and endless uncertainty. There had been weeks when he barely slept, months when failure seemed inevitable, years when success felt impossibly far away. Now those days belonged to another lifetime. Michael smiled as he glanced toward a framed photograph hanging near the kitchen doorway. The picture showed 12 people squeezed into a tiny office. Old computers, cheap desks, second-hand chairs, and a handwritten sign taped to the wall. Horizon Systemics. Employee number 1 had taken the photograph. At the time, none of them imagined the company would survive. Yet somehow it had. Michael stood and walked closer to the frame. One by one he recognized the faces. Some had retired. Some had moved on. A few were no longer alive. But he remembered every single one of them. Not because they helped build a company, because they helped build a family. That had always been his philosophy. Software could be copied. Technology would eventually become outdated. Products would change. People mattered. People were the only reason a company survived. The kitchen phone interrupted his thoughts. Michael smiled when he saw who the caller was. "Good morning, Sarah." His daughter laughed. "Morning, Dad." They spoke for several minutes. Family, grandchildren, the usual topics. Then Sarah asked the question she had been asking for years. "When are you finally going to stop working?" Michael chuckled. "I stopped working 10 years ago. You know what I mean." He smiled. "I do." Most retired founders spend their time golfing. Michael looked out the rain-covered window. "I tried golf. And it was terrible." Sarah laughed. "I knew you'd say that." Their conversation continued for several more minutes before ending with promises to visit the grandchildren later that week. When the call ended, the house became quiet again. Michael finished his coffee. Then his eyes drifted toward a folder resting on the counter. The folder contained an invitation. Later that afternoon, Horizon Systemics would hold a special board meeting, one he was expected to attend. Michael had considered simply arriving for the meeting and leaving afterward. That would certainly have been easier. But another thought had taken hold over the weekend. A simple question. What had the company become? Not financially. He already knew the numbers. Not strategically. The board discussed those regularly. He wanted to know something else. What did the company feel like now? What kind of people worked there? What kind of culture existed inside the building? Years earlier, he had spent nearly every day walking through departments, talking with engineers, meeting interns, listening to customer support teams, learning names, hearing concerns. The larger Horizon Systemics became, the harder that became. Eventually, he stepped away from day-to-day operations entirely. And now, for the first time in years, curiosity had returned. Michael picked up the folder. A small smile appeared. Why not? 2 hours later, a dark sedan pulled into the parking area outside Horizon Systemics headquarters. The building rose high above the city. Glass, steel, modern architecture. Impressive. Far more impressive than the cramped office where everything had started. Michael sat quietly for a moment. Rain slid across the windows. Employees hurried through the weather toward the main entrance. Laptops in hand. Coffee cups balanced carefully. Conversations continuing despite the rain. The sight made him smile. This was never what he had wanted. Not exactly. He had never dreamed about glass towers, or executive suites, or stock valuations. He had dreamed about creating a place where talented people could do meaningful work. The building was simply what came afterward. Michael stepped out of the car. A black umbrella opened above him. He adjusted his coat, then began walking slowly toward the entrance. Employees passed him without a second glance. A few nodded politely. One young woman held the door open. "Good morning." Michael smiled. "Thank you." The young engineer returned the smile before disappearing into the crowd. The interaction lasted only a few seconds. Yet it pleased him enormously. Kindness still existed here. That was a good sign. Very good. He had no way of knowing that only minutes later, his visit would take an unexpected turn. Nor did he know that inside the building, a senior executive named Jason Reed was already having the worst morning of his year. And before the day was over, their paths would collide. When they did, Horizon Systemics would discover whether it still remembered the values on which it had been built. The lobby of Horizon Systemics was larger than Michael remembered. Much larger. The original headquarters had consisted of a reception desk, a conference room barely large enough for 6 people, and a collection of offices that seemed permanently overcrowded. This felt different. The soaring glass ceiling stretched 3 stories overhead. Large digital displays showcased company achievements. Interactive screens highlighted current projects. Employees moved confidently through the space. The company had grown. Very few things remained familiar. Michael paused near the entrance. His eyes drifted toward a wall on the far side of the lobby. A smile appeared immediately. There it was. The founder's display. A large section dedicated to the company's history. Photographs. Awards. Milestones. And directly in the center, his own portrait. The photograph had been taken almost 20 years earlier. Michael laughed softly. "I hated that picture." A nearby receptionist glanced up. "I'm sorry." Michael smiled. "Nothing." The young woman looked relieved and returned to her work. Michael continued toward the display. Several employees passed him. None paid particular attention. A few nodded politely. Most were focused on their phones or conversations. One young engineer stopped briefly beside the display. She studied the photographs, then continued walking. Michael found himself wondering how many employees actually looked at the wall. Probably very few. History tends to become invisible when people see it every day. Eventually, he noticed a familiar face. Emily Chen. The same young engineer who had held the door open. Her employee profile was displayed on a nearby digital recognition board. Outstanding project contribution. Michael smiled. Recognition mattered. Not because people needed praise. Because they needed to know their work mattered. He was still reading when a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Can I help you, sir?" Michael turned. A security officer stood nearby. The man appeared friendly, professional, not threatening. Michael appreciated that. Just looking around. The officer smiled. "First visit," in a manner of speaking. The officer laughed. "Well, you've picked a busy day." Michael glanced around. "So I see." The two spoke briefly before the officer was called away by a radio message. The interaction lasted less than a minute. Yet Michael enjoyed it. People still seemed approachable here. That mattered. More than stock prices. More than revenue reports. More than market share. Culture was harder to build than software, and much easier to lose. A few floors above, however, someone else was beginning to lose patience. Jason Reed stared at his computer screen. The quarterly presentation looked perfect. The board meeting was scheduled for that afternoon. Senior leadership would be attending. Several influential board members would be present. Most importantly, Michael Donovan would finally be attending in person. At least that was the rumor. Jason had never met him. Few executives had. Michael rarely appeared at company functions anymore. To most employees, he was little more than a legend. A name attached to company history. A photograph in the lobby. Jason wasn't particularly interested in legends. He was interested in advancement. And today's presentation represented an opportunity. If everything went well, the board would likely approve his restructuring proposal. If the proposal succeeded, Jason's future at Horizon Systemics would look very bright indeed. His phone rang. The caller ID displayed reception. Jason sighed. He almost ignored it. Almost. Instead, he answered. "This is Jason." The receptionist sounded uncertain. "Sorry to bother you." "What is it?" "There is an elderly gentleman in the lobby." Jason frowned. "And?" "He says he's waiting for the board meeting." Jason immediately looked annoyed. "Does he have a visitor badge?" "No." "Has he checked in?" "No." The receptionist hesitated. "He doesn't seem dangerous." Jason leaned back in his chair. That wasn't the point. The company hosted investors regularly. Security procedures existed for a reason. Did he say who invited him? No. Jason sighed. "I'll handle it." The call ended. For a moment Jason considered sending security. Then he changed his mind. The board meeting was only hours away. Visitors wandering around without authorization looked unprofessional. He would deal with it personally. 5 minutes later, the elevator doors opened into the main lobby. Jason immediately spotted the man. Gray hair, dark coat, umbrella resting beside a chair. The elderly visitor appeared completely relaxed, almost as though he belonged there. Jason disliked that immediately. He approached. The receptionist looked relieved. "Sir?" Michael looked up. "Yes." Jason offered a professional smile. The kind that wasn't really a smile. "Good morning." "Good morning. I'm Jason Reed, Senior Vice President." Michael nodded politely. "Pleased to meet you." Jason remained standing. "Reception informs me you're waiting for a board meeting." "That's correct." "May I ask who invited you?" Michael smiled. "The board." Jason waited. Nothing more came. The answer irritated him. "The board is a large group of people." Michael nodded. "It certainly is." The response wasn't intended to be funny, but somehow it felt amusing. Jason didn't appreciate it. "Do you have written confirmation?" "No." "Visitor credentials?" "No." "An appointment number?" "No." Jason's patience began to disappear. Meanwhile, Several employees moving through the lobby had started paying attention. The conversation wasn't loud, but it was noticeable. Michael remained perfectly calm. Jason increasingly wasn't. And for the first time that morning, Michael began to suspect that his visit might become more complicated than he had expected. For several long moments, Jason Reed stood beside the reception desk studying the elderly visitor. The situation should have been simple. A visitor arrives. The visitor checks in. The visitor receives authorization. The visitor enters. Instead, he found himself standing before a man who seemed completely unconcerned by any of it. That bothered him. "Sir," Jason said patiently, "I'm trying to understand why you're here." Michael smiled politely. "I told you. You're attending a board meeting." "That's correct." Jason folded his arms. "And yet you have no documentation." "No. No visitor authorization." "No. No confirmation email." "No." The conversation felt absurd. Several employees moving through the lobby had begun paying attention. Not because anyone was raising their voice, because the contrast between the two men was becoming impossible to ignore. Jason appeared increasingly frustrated. Michael appeared increasingly relaxed. The imbalance unsettled him. "Do you at least have identification?" Michael reached into his coat pocket. A driver's license appeared. Jason examined it briefly. Michael Donovan. The name seemed vaguely familiar, but only vaguely. The company employed thousands of people. The name meant nothing to him. He handed the license back. "Mr. Donovan, without proper authorization, I can't allow you access to the board meeting." Michael nodded. "I understand." Jason blinked. That wasn't the response he expected. Most people argued. Most complained. Most demanded exceptions. Michael simply nodded. The reaction should have ended the conversation. Instead, it somehow made Jason more suspicious. "Then perhaps you should contact whoever invited you." Michael smiled. "They already know I'm coming." Jason sighed. "We've established that." The receptionist looked increasingly uncomfortable. Several employees nearby exchanged glances. One young engineer paused near the founder display. Emily Chen. She had witnessed the conversation from a distance. Something about the elderly man felt familiar. She couldn't explain why. Meanwhile, Jason's patience was running out. The board meeting was approaching. Investors would begin arriving soon. Everything needed to run smoothly. Instead, he was standing in the lobby debating visitor policy. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one final time." Michael looked up. "All right. Who specifically invited you?" Michael considered the question, then answered honestly. "The chairman." Jason laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, but enough. Enough for employees to notice. Enough for Michael to notice. The lobby became strangely quiet. "The chairman invited you personally?" "Yes." Jason shook his head. "I find that difficult to believe." Michael remained calm. "That's all right." Again, that answer. That infuriating calm. As if none of this mattered. As if the outcome had already been decided. Jason looked toward reception. "Has anyone confirmed this visitor's claim?" The receptionist shook her head. "No." Jason made his decision. "Frank." A voice answered from across the lobby. The head of security approached. Frank Morales. 55 years old. 20 years in corporate security. A man who rarely rushed to conclusions. He stopped beside Jason. "What's going on?" Jason gestured toward Michael. "This gentleman claims he has been invited to the board meeting." Frank nodded politely toward Michael. "Good morning." "Good morning." Jason continued. "He has no authorization. No confirmation. No visitor credentials. Frank looked thoughtful. Then he looked at Michael. Something flickered across his face. Recognition. Not complete recognition. More like a memory struggling to surface. "Have we met before?" Frank asked. Michael smiled. "A long time ago." Frank frowned. The voice felt familiar. The face felt familiar. Yet he couldn't place it. Jason interrupted. "That's not relevant." Frank glanced toward him. "We're just trying to understand the situation." "The situation is already clear." Frank said nothing. Michael said nothing. The silence irritated Jason even further. Finally, he straightened his jacket. "Mr. Donovan." Michael looked up. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Several nearby employees stopped moving. The words seemed to freeze the entire lobby. Michael remained seated. Not defiantly, simply thoughtfully. "Are you certain?" The question was asked quietly, respectfully, without challenge. Yet it landed heavily, very heavily. Jason immediately interpreted it as resistance. "Yes." Michael nodded. "I understand." The same answer Samuel Carter had once given Richard Hayes, though neither man knew it. Frank shifted uncomfortably. "Jason, maybe we should make a few calls first." Jason shook his head. "There isn't time." The security chief looked unconvinced. "There is always time to verify. The board meeting begins soon." "And?" Jason lowered his voice. "And we have procedures." There it was. Procedures. Rules. Policy. Everything that protected the company. Everything Jason believed made organizations successful. Frank looked toward Michael one last time. Something still felt wrong. Very wrong. Yet he had no reason to overrule an executive. Not yet. Michael slowly stood. He picked up his umbrella, then glanced toward the large founder display on the wall. For a brief moment his eyes lingered on the photograph. Emily noticed. So did Frank. Jason did not. Michael smiled faintly, then turned back toward the group. No hard feelings. The words stunned everyone, especially Jason. Who says that after being removed from a building? Michael extended his hand. After a brief hesitation, Jason shook it. The elderly founder's grip was steady, confident, comfortable, as though he had absolutely nothing to prove. Then Michael walked toward the exit. Employees watched silently. The lobby doors opened. Rain swept briefly inside. Moments later, Michael Donovan disappeared into the gray afternoon. For reasons he couldn't explain, Jason felt no satisfaction, only relief. The problem had been solved. The visitor was gone. The board meeting could proceed. Everything was back under control. At least that was what he believed. But as Frank watched the doors close, a troubling thought finally surfaced. Michael Donovan. The name. The face. The photograph. Frank slowly turned toward the founder display. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he laughed softly. "No way." The receptionist looked up. "What?" Frank pointed toward the portrait. That wasn't a visitor. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph. That was Michael Donovan. The receptionist's face went pale. Frank, however, found himself smiling. Somehow he wasn't worried about Michael. If anything, he was worried about the board meeting that was about to begin, and especially about the executive who had just complimented the founder of Horizon Systemics out of his own building. The boardroom of Horizon Systemics occupied the top floor of the headquarters building. Rain streaked across the floor-to-ceiling windows. Beyond them, the city stretched into the gray afternoon. Inside, Executives and board members gradually took their seats. Jason Reed felt much better than he had an hour earlier. The visitor issue had been resolved. The board meeting was beginning. His presentation was ready. Everything was finally back on schedule. The chairman sat at the head of the table reviewing several documents. Beside him were board members, investors, and senior executives. Conversations flowed quietly through the room. Jason recognized most of the faces. Some had helped build Horizon Systemics. Others had joined during its expansion. Together, they represented decades of experience and enormous influence. The chairman glanced at his watch, then toward the door. A faint smile appeared. Jason noticed it. Several board members seemed unusually relaxed, almost expectant. One even appeared amused. The atmosphere felt different from most meetings, more personal somehow. Jason couldn't explain why. Eventually, the chairman looked up. "Before we begin, there is one person we are waiting for." Several board members nodded. One smiled. Another laughed softly. Jason assumed they were referring to an investor, or perhaps a guest speaker. Nothing seemed unusual about that. 5 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. The room immediately quieted. The chairman smiled. "There he is." Jason turned toward the entrance. The door opened. For a moment he didn't understand what he was seeing. An elderly man entered carrying a dark folder. His gray hair was slightly damp from the rain. His coat had been replaced by a simple navy suit. The face looked familiar. Very familiar. Then Jason felt his stomach drop. Michael Donovan. The room rose to its feet almost instantly. Board members smiled. Several crossed the room to greet him. Hands were shaken. Greetings exchanged. One investor laughed. "Still arriving without warning, Michael?" Another smiled. "Some things never change." Michael chuckled. "Apparently not." Jason sat frozen in his chair. The room suddenly felt very small, very quiet, very difficult to breathe in. The chairman stepped forward. "Good to see you." "And you." The two men shook hands warmly. Then the chairman gestured toward an empty seat beside him. Not across the room. Not at the end of the table. Beside him. A place reserved for one of the most important people in the company. Michael took his seat. Only then did he glance toward Jason. Their eyes met briefly. Michael nodded politely, exactly as he had done in the lobby. Nothing more. No accusation. No anger. No satisfaction. Somehow that made the situation worse. Much worse. The chairman looked around the room. "Now that everyone is here, we can begin." Jason struggled to focus. His thoughts raced. The lobby. The conversation. The visitor badge. The founder display. The handshake. Every moment replayed itself with horrifying clarity. The chairman opened the meeting. "Before we move to today's agenda, I believe we should acknowledge something important." Several board members smiled. The chairman continued. "Today marks 25 years since Michael Donovan founded Horizon Systemics." A round of applause filled the room. Warm, genuine, heartfelt. Jason wanted to disappear. The chairman looked toward Michael. "I know you dislike attention." The room laughed. "Which is exactly why we're going to give you some." More laughter. Michael shook his head. "You're impossible." The atmosphere felt like a family gathering, not a corporate meeting. People genuinely cared about him, not because he had founded the company, because they knew him, respected him, trusted him. Eventually, the applause faded. The chairman smiled. "Would you like to say a few words?" Michael hesitated, then stood. The room immediately became attentive. Even after all these years, people still listened when Michael Donovan spoke. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. Michael looked around the room, then toward the rain-covered windows. Finally, he spoke. When we started Horizon Systemics, we had 12 employees. A few smiles appeared. Several people knew the story. We couldn't afford proper desks. Laughter. We couldn't afford proper chairs. More laughter. And there were months when we weren't entirely sure we could afford electricity. The room relaxed. Michael smiled. But none of that mattered. His voice remained calm, thoughtful. The company was never the building. Silence returned. It was never the software. People listened carefully. It was never the technology. The room grew still. It was always the people. Something about the way he said it felt important, as though the sentence carried more weight than anyone yet understood. Michael continued. The greatest achievement of Horizon Systemics isn't what we built. He looked around the room. It's who we built it with. Several board members nodded. The chairman smiled quietly. Michael sat down. The room applauded once more. And only then did the chairman turn toward Jason Reed. Before we continue, the smile remained on his face. But now there was curiosity behind it. Jason. Jason's heart sank. Yes. The chairman folded his hands. I understand you met Michael earlier today. Silence fell across the room. Absolute silence. For the first time since entering the boardroom, Jason realized that everyone was about to learn exactly how that meeting had gone. And there was nowhere left to hide. The silence in the boardroom felt almost physical. Every eye turned toward Jason Reed. And for perhaps the first time in his professional life, Jason wished nobody were looking at him. The chairman folded his hands. I understand there was an incident in the lobby this afternoon. Jason swallowed. There was. The chairman nodded. Would you like to explain what happened? Jason looked around the room. There was nowhere to hide. No clever explanation. No polished presentation. No corporate language that could change reality. So he chose honesty. I believed I was following company policy. The chairman remained silent. Jason continued. I thought I was protecting the company. Several board members exchanged glances. Michael Donovan simply listened. I asked for visitor credentials. Jason looked down. I asked for authorization. His voice grew quieter. And when I couldn't verify either one, I asked Mr. Donovan to leave. The room remained silent. Not hostile. Just attentive. Jason finally looked toward Michael. I was wrong. For several moments nobody spoke. Then something unexpected happened. Michael smiled. Not triumphantly. Not sarcastically. Simply kindly. Actually, he said, I don't think you were entirely wrong. Several people looked surprised. The chairman raised an eyebrow. Jason looked genuinely confused. Michael stood. Slowly. Comfortably. As though there was nowhere else he needed to be. Then he looked around the room. I spent the morning walking through Horizon Systemics. His voice remained calm. I spoke with employees. The board members listened carefully. I visited departments. He smiled faintly. And apparently I tested security procedures without meaning to. A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Even Jason managed a nervous smile. Michael continued. What I saw today made me very happy. That surprised everyone, including Jason. Michael looked toward the rain-covered windows. When we started this company, we hoped to build something that would last. His gaze moved around the room. A place people would care about. A place worth protecting. The room grew quiet. Then Michael looked directly at Jason. And today, I met an executive who cared enough to protect it. Jason stared. He wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Michael smiled. The problem wasn't that you cared. The room listened carefully. The problem was that you stopped at procedure. The words were gentle, but they landed with remarkable force. A company cannot run without rules. Several people nodded. But it cannot thrive without judgment. Michael paused. Long enough for the sentence to settle. Then he continued. Years ago, we taught our managers something very simple. His eyes moved across the boardroom. If a situation doesn't make sense, slow down. The room became completely still. Ask questions. Listen. Think. He smiled. Most mistakes become obvious when people take the time to understand each other. Jason lowered his eyes, because he knew exactly what Michael meant. The chairman leaned back thoughtfully. Several board members nodded. No one appeared angry. That somehow made the lesson harder to ignore. Michael continued. I was asked to leave a building that bears my company's name. A few smiles appeared, but I was treated politely. He looked toward Frank Morales, who sat near the back of the room. The security team remained professional. Frank smiled. Michael looked toward the receptionist. Employees were respectful. Then his gaze returned to Jason, and an executive tried to do what he believed was right. The room remained silent. The lesson isn't that people failed. Michael shook his head. The lesson is that we can always do better. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then the chairman smiled. That sounds like something you would say. Laughter filled the room. Warm. Genuine. The tension finally began to disappear. Michael sat down. The chairman looked toward Jason. Mr. Reed. Jason straightened. I hope you've learned something useful today. I have. The answer came immediately, without hesitation, without excuses. The chairman nodded. Good. The matter ended there. Not with punishment, not with humiliation, but with understanding. Several months later, employees would still talk about that board meeting. Not because of conflict, because of what happened afterward. Jason Reed's promotion was delayed, not canceled. Delayed. The board wanted to see growth, not in revenue, not in presentations, in leadership. To Jason's credit, he accepted the decision, and over the following months, something changed. He began spending time with employees he had previously ignored. He visited departments, asked questions, listened, not because Michael Donovan told him to, because he finally understood why it mattered. As for Michael, he returned to his quiet life. Board meetings, family visits, occasional appearances, exactly as before. Yet one small thing changed. Several weeks after the incident, he visited Horizon Systemics again. This time the receptionist recognized him immediately. So did security. So did many employees. Word had spread. As Michael crossed the lobby, a young engineer approached him. Emily Chan, the same employee who had watched the confrontation weeks earlier. Mr. Donovan? Michael smiled. Yes. Emily hesitated, then laughed. I just wanted to thank you. For what? For reminding everyone why this place exists. For a moment, Michael said nothing. Then he looked around the lobby. Employees talking, teams collaborating, people helping one another. Life continuing. The company had changed, yet somehow remained the same. Finally, he smiled. I didn't remind them. Emily looked confused. Michael nodded toward the people around them. They already knew. His eyes drifted toward the founder display. The old photographs still were there. 12 people. Second-hand desks. Impossible dreams. Growing bigger and bigger. Then he looked back at the busy lobby. They just needed to remember. And with that, Michael Donovan continued walking through the company he had built. Not as a founder, not as a legend, but as something he had always believed was far more important. A person among people.